The good news is that Boleyn became Queen of England, wore the finest gowns money could buy, and lived in actual castles with servants who probably had servants. The bad news is that her husband was Henry VIII, a man with the emotional stability of a toddler denied dessert, and her reign lasted about as long as a celebrity marriage in modern Hollywood. Except instead of a divorce settlement, she got a date with an executioner. So buckle up, because we're about to dive into the story of a woman who literally lost her head trying to keep a crown on it. And honestly, the workplace toxicity makes your terrible boss look like a saint. And Boleyn wasn't born into royalty, which in Tudor England was like showing up to the Oscars without a +1. Technically possible, but socially awkward. She was born around 1501 or 1507, because apparently record-keeping back then was as reliable as your phone's autocorrect, and historians still argue about it like it's a celebrity's real age. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was an ambitious social climber who saw his daughters as investment properties, which sounds horrifying until you realize that was pretty much standard operating procedure for ambitious Tudor dads. And spent her formative years in France, attending the French court where she learned to speak French fluently, play instruments, dance, and basically became the Renaissance equivalent of that annoyingly talented kid who makes everyone else look bad at the school talent show. When it returned to England around 1522, she wasn't just another pretty face at court. She was sophisticated, witty, and had that certain je ne sais quoi that comes from actually knowing what je ne sais quoi means. She had dark hair and dark eyes, which was exotic in a sea of boring English blondes, and apparently a 6-finger on one hand or an extra nail, depending on which gossipy source you believe. This supposed deformity later got weaponized by her enemies as proof she was a witch, because nothing says logical conclusion like extra fingernail equals Satan's BFF. She also had a large mole on her neck that she strategically covered with chokers and high collars, inventing the turtleneck's ancestor and proving that fashion has always been about hiding our perceived flaws while pretending we're just being stylish. And first caught Henry VIII's attention around 1526, when he was still married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess who'd been his wife for nearly 2 decades and had given him exactly 0 male heirs who survived infancy. Henry was having what we'd now call a midlife crisis, except instead of buying a sports car, he decided he needed a new wife and a son, preferably in that order. And Sister Mary had already been Henry's mistress, which makes family dinners retroactively awkward, but it had apparently learned from Mary's experience that giving the king what he wanted without a ring meant you'd get used and discarded faster than a streaming service free trial. So when Henry came sniffing around with his royal pickup lines and basically invented playing hard to get at the expert level, the king wrote and love letters that still survive today, and they're exactly as cringeworthy as you'd expect from a powerful man who's not used to hearing no. Henry wrote poetry. He sent gifts. He probably would have sent her good morning texts if texting existed, and kept him at arm's length like a professional. She refused to become his mistress, insisting that she'd only share his bed as his wife, which was either a brilliant power move or the worst gamble in Tudor history. Spoiler alert, it was somehow both simultaneously. This dragged on for years, with Henry becoming increasingly obsessed and maintaining her position like someone holding out for a promotion while their boss desperately needs them to stay at the company. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon was not going quietly into that good night. And honestly, who could blame her? She'd been a faithful wife for decades, survived multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, raised their daughter Mary, and now her husband wanted a divorce because she'd failed to produce a son, which biologically speaking was actually Henry's fault since the father's sperm determines the baby's sex. But scientific facts have never stopped men from blaming women for things beyond their control. Catherine refused to accept the divorce, dug in her heels, and had the backing of her nephew, Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor and generally not someone you wanted to piss off. This created a diplomatic nightmare that would make modern political scandals look like minor administrative hiccups. Henry's solution to his Catherine problem was to basically break up with the entire Catholic Church, which is the ultimate, if you won't give me what I want, I'll create my own rules move. He declared himself supreme head of the Church of England in 1534, dissolve his marriage to Catherine without the Pope's permission, and essentially started a new religion because he wanted to sleep with and Boleyn legally. Let that sink in. The English Reformation, one of the most significant religious and political upheavals in European history, happened partly because one man couldn't keep it in his royal pants and wanted to upgrade his wife. If that's not the most extra reason to start a religious revolution, I don't know what is, and it makes every petty thing you've ever done look reasonable by comparison. And Henry finally married in secret in January 1533. And by March, she was already pregnant, which timeline-wise suggests they'd definitely been practicing before the wedding night despite all that virtuous waiting. And was crowned Queen of England on June 1st, 1533, in a ceremony that was as lavish as Henry could make it, though many of the English people already hated her for replacing Catherine and blamed her for the religious chaos tearing the country apart. Being unpopular with the people you're supposed to rule is never a great start to a queenship. And it's like getting hired as CEO when everyone loved your predecessor and thinks you slept your way to the top. Except in Anne's case, that was literally true. And also her predecessor wasn't actually gone, just demoted to Princess Dowager Arthur, and pretending that title wasn't the medieval equivalent of K-Bai. On September 7th, 1533, and gave birth to a baby. And here's where things get tragically hilarious. After all that waiting, scheming, church breaking, and kingdom shaking, the baby was a girl. They'd already prepared announcements declaring the birth of a prince, and someone had to awkwardly cross out the S to make prince into princess. That baby was Elizabeth, who would eventually become Elizabeth I, one of England's greatest monarchs, but nobody knew that yet. They just knew and had failed her first major assignment as queen. Henry was disappointed, but tried to be optimistic, probably telling himself and that sons would surely follow, like someone buying lottery tickets, thinking their luck has to change eventually because they're due for a win any day now. For about 2 years, and remained queen, but the clock was ticking louder than a bomb in an action movie. She had at least 2 miscarriages after Elizabeth, including one in 1536, where the fetus was reportedly male, which was both medically traumatic and politically catastrophic because it proved she could conceive boys, but apparently couldn't carry them to term. Henry's patience, never his strongest virtue, was wearing thinner than his hairline, and he'd already noticed one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, who was playing the same demure and unavailable game and had once played so successfully. History was repeating itself, except this time, and was the one being replaced, and she could see the writing on the wall written in her own strategic playbook from years earlier. The irony of Anne's situation would be delicious if it weren't so terrifying. She'd won her crown by refusing to be a mistress and insisting on marriage, thereby destroying a queen and changing England's religion forever. And now she was losing that same crown to another woman using identical tactics, while a king grew bored with her. It's like watching someone get fired using the exact same excuse they'd use to get their predecessor fired, except instead of just losing your job, you're about to lose your head, literally. And had gambled everything on her ability to give Henry a son. And when she couldn't deliver, she discovered that being queen without producing an heir was just unemployment with better jewelry and significantly worse severance packages than anyone should have to negotiate. By early 1536, and Boleyn's position was shakier than a Jenga tower in an earthquake, and Henry VIII had already mentally swiped left on their marriage while eyeing Jane Seymour like she was a fresh dating profile with all the right filters. The problem was that Henry couldn't just divorce in the way he divorced Catherine, because that would mean admitting his whole break with Rome thing was a massive mistake, and powerful men would literally rather commit murder than admit they were wrong about something. So Henry needed a different exit strategy, something that would eliminate and permanently, while making him look like the victim, which is the Tudor equivalent of starting a fight and then crying to the teacher first. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the Renaissance version of a political fixer who could make problems disappear faster than your motivation on a Monday morning. Cromwell had initially supported, and because she was Protestant-friendly and aligned with his religious reform agenda. But now he realized she was becoming a liability rather than an asset, like investing in cryptocurrency right before a crash. and had made enemies at court by being outspoken and having opinions, which apparently was fine when Henry was obsessed with her, but became shrill and difficult once he lost interest, proving that men have been using double standards about women's assertiveness since literally forever. Cromwell decided that removing and would solve multiple problems simultaneously, advance his political agenda, and keep him in Henry's good graces. So he started building a case against her that was flimsier than a house of cards in a windstorm, but backed by royal authority. The charges Cromwell concocted against and were so outrageous they'd be laughable if they hadn't resulted in actual executions. Adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother George Boleyn, plus treason and plotting to kill the king. Let's be clear, these accusations were about as credible as a conspiracy theory you'd find in the darkest corners of the internet, with zero actual evidence and timelines that didn't even make logical sense, and was supposedly having affairs while being constantly surrounded by attendants, guards, and ladies-in-waiting, which would require ninja-level stealth skills and a complete ignorance of how royal households worked, where privacy was rarer than a unicorn and queens couldn't even use the bathroom without someone knowing about it. But facts are irrelevant when the king wants you gone and has the entire government apparatus ready to make it happen. On May 2nd, 1536, and was arrested at Greenwich Palace and taken to the Tower of London by barge, traveling the same river route she'd taken just 3 years earlier for her coronation, except this time with significantly less pageantry and zero chances of a happy ending. She was imprisoned in the same royal apartments where she'd stayed before her coronation, which is like being forced to celebrate your divorce in the same venue where you got married. Maximum psychological torture with a side of cruel irony, and reportedly broke down upon arrival, oscillating between hysteria and composure, asking her jailers about the charges and protesting her innocence, while simultaneously making jokes about her situation, because apparently even facing execution couldn't stop her from having a sense of humor darker than midnight in a cave. The 5 men accused of adultery with and were arrested around the same time, and their crimes basically amounted to being friendly with the Queen or working in her household. Mark Smeaton was a court musician who was probably tortured into confessing, because nothing says reliable testimony like words extracted under physical duress in a time when torture was considered a totally legitimate investigative technique. Henry Norris was a groom of the stool, which sounds disgusting, but was actually a prestigious position helping the king with his bathroom needs. Yes, that was a real job, and yes, proximity to the royal behind was considered an honor because priorities in Tudor England were fundamentally different from ours. William Brereton, Francis Weston, and George Boleyn, his own brother, rounded out the accused, creating a scandal so salacious it made 16th century England lose its collective mind with gossip. The accusation of incest with her brother George was particularly vile and completely unsubstantiated, added purely for shock value, because apparently regular adultery wasn't scandalous enough and they needed to make and seem as monstrous as possible. George's wife, Jane Boleyn, allegedly provided testimony against both her husband and though historians debate whether she was coerced, trying to save herself, or genuinely believed something inappropriate had occurred, which shows that marital loyalty under pressure is complicated even without the threat of execution hanging over everything. The incest charge was essentially the Tudor version of throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, except what stuck was a sword to his neck, so maybe we shouldn't use that metaphor too literally given what's coming. His trial took place on May 15th, 1536, at the Tower of London, and calling it a trial is generous considering the verdict was predetermined, and the whole thing was theater designed to give Henry's murderous intentions a veneer of legal legitimacy, and defended herself eloquently and with dignity, denying all charges and pointing out the logical impossibilities of the accusations, like how she supposedly committed adultery on dates, when she was verifiably elsewhere, or how she managed to conduct multiple affairs in one of the most surveilled environments in England. She was articulate, composed, and convincing, which under normal circumstances might have mattered. But these weren't normal circumstances. This was a kangaroo court where the kangaroo was replaced by a king who'd already picked out his next wife and ordered a special French sword for the execution, because even when murdering his spouse, Henry wanted to be classy about it. The jury of 27 peers found and guilty of all charges, because saying not guilty when the king wanted her dead would have been career suicide and possibly actual suicide, depending on how vindictive Henry felt that day. Her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided over the trial and pronounced the sentence, and would be burned at the stake or beheaded at the king's pleasure, which is perhaps the most ominous use of the word pleasure in human history. The fact that burning was even an option shows how seriously they were treating these fabricated charges, since burning was typically reserved for heretics and traitors of the worst kind, making this whole proceeding even more grotesquely excessive than it already was, like using a nuclear bomb to kill a spider and then claiming the spider was the real threat all along. Anne's brother George and the other 4 accused men were executed on May 17, 1536, on Tower Hill, and they all died maintaining various degrees of innocence or making cryptic final statements that historians still argue about today. Mark Smeaton, the musician who'd confessed under torture, still maintained his confession at the scaffold, either because the torture had broken him completely or because he hoped confessing would somehow save his family from repercussions, proving that coerced confessions are worthless as evidence, but very useful for people in power who need scapegoats. The executions of these men served as the opening act to Anne's main event, warming up the crowd and establishing that Henry meant business. Like trailers before the main feature, except everyone dies and there's no popcorn, just public bloodshed masquerading as justice. After her conviction, Anne was kept in her Tower apartments awaiting execution while Henry partied like he'd just gotten out of a bad relationship and was ready to mingle, which technically he had and was, and wrote letters asserting her innocence, prepared herself spiritually with the help of the Archbishop of Canterbury's chaplain, and reportedly said she'd heard the executioner was very good, joking that she had a little neck, which is either the bravest gallows humor in history or a coping mechanism for facing unimaginable terror. Meanwhile, Henry was already making arrangements to marry Jane Seymour, because apparently the appropriate mourning period for a wife you're executing for treason is approximately 0 days. Maybe negative days if you count all the pre-planning involved in lining up your next bride before the current one loses her head, and requested that a skilled executioner from Calais be brought to England for her beheading. And Henry agreed to this request, swapping the traditional axe for a sword because apparently he had enough residual affection or guilty conscience to want her death to be as quick and painless as possible, which is like saying, I'm going to murder you, but I'll use the expensive method. The swordsman from Calais was experienced and professional, making him the Tudor equivalent of a specialist consultant brought in for high-profile cases, except instead of fixing a company's IT problems, he was fixing the king's wife problem by removing her head in one clean swing. This attention to execution detail shows that even in state-sanctioned murder, the Tudors maintained certain standards of quality control that would make modern project managers weep with envy at their thoroughness. On May 19, 1536, just 17 days after her arrest, and Boleyn walked out to the scaffold on Tower Green before a crowd of spectators who'd gathered to watch a queen die like it was the hottest show in town, because public executions were the Netflix of the 16th century, except you couldn't pause them or look away without being weird, and wore a gray damask gown trimmed with fur and a red underskirt, red being the liturgical color of martyrdom, which was either intentional symbolism or an incredibly on-the-nose fashion choice for someone about to bleed out. She gave a final speech that was diplomatically vague, neither admitting guilt nor directly proclaiming innocence, asking people to pray for the king and judge her mercifully, which under the circumstances showed more grace than Henry deserved, but was politically smart since she had a daughter whose future depended on not pissing off the man who just orchestrated this entire murderous charade to upgrade his wife's situation, and remove her headdress and tucked her hair into a cap so the executioner would have a clear shot at her neck, which is the kind of practical preparation that makes you realize even your final moments you're essentially helping your murderer do his job more efficiently, like organizing your desk before getting fired, except infinitely more permanent and significantly more fatal. She knelt upright rather than placing her head on a block, because the French sword method required a different execution position, and she kept repeating prayers while blindfolded, waiting for the blow that would end her life. The executioner, being a professional with apparently some shred of human decency, called out for someone to bring him his sword even though he was already holding it, making and turn her head toward the sound so he could strike while she was distracted and wouldn't tense up in anticipation, which is either merciful or the most elaborate and morbid magic trick in history, depending on how you want to frame premeditated decapitation. The sword came down in one clean stroke, severing Anne's head from her body so quickly that allegedly her lips were still moving in prayer after her head was separated, which is either historical fact or the kind of gruesome detail people add to execution stories to make them more memorable at dinner parties. Her body and head were gathered up unceremoniously and placed in an elm arrow chest because apparently nobody had bothered to prepare an actual coffin for an executed queen, proving that government efficiency problems existed long before modern bureaucracy, and that even royal executions could be undermined by poor logistical planning. She was buried in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds, in an unmarked grave, because nothing says we definitely had legitimate reasons for killing you, like refusing to even acknowledge where we put your body afterward. The execution of Anne Boleyn was completed before 9 in the morning, and by that afternoon Henry VIII was already celebrating with Jane Seymour, because the appropriate period for processing your wife's state-sanctioned murder is apparently somewhere between 0 and -3 hours if you're a Tudor king with the emotional depth of a puddle. Henry and Jane were formally betrothed the next day, May 20th, and married on May 30th, just 11 days after Anne's execution, which has to be some kind of record for terrible timing and proves that Henry had absolutely no shame about the optics of the situation. Jane was everything and wasn't. Quiet, submissive, conventionally obedient, and willing to play the role of decorative baby maker without the inconvenience of having opinions, which was exactly what Henry wanted after 3 years of Anne's intelligence, and assertiveness reminded him that women could have personalities beyond agreeable furniture. The speed with which Henry moved on reveals the entire situation for what it really was, a ruthlessly calculated political execution dressed up as justice, with adultery and treason charges functioning as convenient legal cover for a king who wanted to trade in his current wife for a newer model and needed everyone to believe he was the victim. Henry's government immediately began a propaganda campaign to blacken Anne's name and justify the execution, spreading rumors about her supposed affairs, her alleged plotting, and even reviving old stories about her extra fingernail to suggest she'd been a witch all along. Because when you've just murdered someone, you need to make sure public opinion stays on your side, or at least stays confused enough not to ask uncomfortable questions. This character assassination continued for years, with chroniclers who wanted to stay in Henry's good graces describing Anne as a seductress, a schemer, and essentially the villain of her own execution story, which is victim blaming taken to its logical extreme, where the victim is blamed even for her own judicial murder. Anne's daughter Elizabeth, not even 3 years old when her mother was executed, was declared illegitimate by Parliament shortly after the execution, which meant she lost her position in the succession and her title as princess, getting demoted to Lady Elizabeth faster than you can say daddy issues. This illegitimacy declaration was legally absurd considering Henry had broken with Rome specifically to marry and legitimately. But consistency has never been a strong suit for authoritarian regimes that need to rewrite history to match current political needs. Elizabeth grew up knowing her mother had been executed for crimes she supposedly committed but never actually did, which is the kind of childhood trauma that either destroys you or turns you into one of the most formidable monarchs in English history. And fortunately for England, Elizabeth chose option 2 with a vengeance that would make therapists' heads spin. The men who orchestrated Anne's downfall didn't exactly live happily ever after, because karma in Tudor England had a delayed but thorough delivery system. Thomas Cromwell, who'd built the case against, and himself fell from grace just 4 years later in 1540 and was executed on charges just as fabricated as those he'd leveled against and proving that what goes around comes around, especially when you work for a paranoid tyrant with unlimited power and the attention span of a goldfish. Henry eventually married 4 more times after Jane Seymour died in childbirth, giving him his precious son Edward. And he executed wife number 5, Catherine Howard, in 1542 using the same playbook he'd used on and adultery charges, treason, beheading. Because when you find a murder method that works, why change your routine or learn healthier relationship coping mechanisms? The question of Anne's actual guilt has been debated by historians for nearly 500 years, and the consensus is overwhelmingly that she was innocent of all charges, which seems obvious when you consider that the evidence was non-existent, the timelines were impossible, and the whole trial was orchestrated by people who had everything to gain from her death. The adultery charges fall apart under the slightest scrutiny because Anne was never alone and was constantly attended by ladies-in-waiting who would have noticed if their boss was conducting 5 simultaneous affairs, including one with her brother. Unless we're supposed to believe dozens of attendants were all complicit in elaborate cover-ups or collectively blind and deaf. Modern historians have thoroughly dismantled every charge, showing that Anne was executed not for any actual crime, but because she failed to produce a male heir and Henry wanted her replaced, which transforms her execution from justice in a murder with a crown on top. Anne's reputation underwent a massive rehabilitation starting in the 19th century when historians began seriously questioning the charges against her and recognizing her execution for the political assassination. It was, though it took literally hundreds of years for people to say, wait, maybe we should question whether a trial conducted by the husband who wanted to remarry was actually fair. Victorian historians started portraying Anne more sympathetically, recognizing her intelligence and her role in bringing Protestant reform to England, though they still couldn't quite shake the tendency to blame her for somehow bringing about her own downfall by being too ambitious or too sexual or too something. Because even in rehabilitation, women apparently need to have done something wrong to deserve their murders. The feminist reclamation of Anne Boleyn in the 20th and 21st centuries has positioned her as a victim of misogyny and political machination, a woman punished for having agency and intelligence in a world that demanded female submission, which honestly is just describing most of human history with slightly different costumes and execution methods. Anne's story has inspired countless novels, films, television shows, and musical numbers, making her one of the most famous queens in English history, despite her reign lasting only 1,000 days, which is impressive cultural staying power for someone whose main historical claim to fame is getting her head cut off by her husband. She's been portrayed as everything from manipulative seductress to a romantic heroine to a proto-feminist icon, depending on which era is doing the interpreting and what point they're trying to make about women, power, and what happens when you threaten male authority by refusing to be controllable. The fascination with and endures because her story hits all the narrative sweet spots: sex, power, religion, scandal, and a literally headless ending that provides the kind of dramatic closure that writers dream about, but would never actually wish on a real person unless they're monsters. What often gets lost in the romanticization and dramatization of Anne's story is the sheer terror she must have felt in those 17 days between arrest and execution, knowing she was innocent, but also knowing that innocence was completely irrelevant when the entire state apparatus was committed to killing her. She watched her brother and the other accused men get executed 2 days before her own death, knowing their deaths were her preview, and spent her final hours in the tower preparing to die for crimes she didn't commit, while the man who'd promised to love and cherish her was literally partying with a replacement. The psychological torture of that situation is almost incomprehensible from our modern perspective, like being gaslit to death by someone with nuclear weapons. Except the nuclear weapons are political power and the gaslighting is a show trial with a predetermined outcome. Anne's execution changed England in ways Henry VIII never intended, because by breaking with Rome to marry her, he'd set in motion the English Reformation that would reshape English religion, politics, and culture for centuries. Her daughter Elizabeth, the little girl declared illegitimate after Anne's death, would eventually become Elizabeth I and rule for 45 years, ushering in a golden age of English power and culture that made her father's reign look like amateur hour with better costumes. Anne's influence lived on through Elizabeth, who inherited her mother's intelligence, political acumen, and probably some serious trust issues around men and marriage, given that she watched every marriage around her end in death, divorce, or disaster, and very sensibly decided to skip the whole thing and marry England instead, which was arguably the smartest relationship decision any Tudor ever made. The location of Anne's grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula remained unmarked for centuries until Victorian renovations in 1876 uncovered her remains, which were then properly identified and given a memorial tablet in the chapel floor. Because apparently it only takes 340 years to get a proper grave marker when you're an executed queen whose husband wanted everyone to forget you existed. Today, tourists visit the Tower of London by the thousands to see where Anne was executed, imprisoned, and buried, which means she's now a tourist attraction bringing in revenue for the same institution that killed her, proving that capitalism will monetize absolutely anything, including judicial murder, if you wait long enough and add a gift shop with themed merchandise. The trials leading up to Anne's execution were such a masterclass in judicial corruption that they'd make modern political scandals look like minor parking violations in comparison. And the fact that Henry VIII managed to convince anyone these proceedings were legitimate says less about the quality of evidence and more about what happens when you give absolute power to someone with the emotional regulation skills of a toddler denied a cookie. The trial of the 5 men accused of adultery with and took place on May 12, 1536, at Westminster Hall, where they faced charges that range from plausible if you squint to absolutely ridiculous even by 16th century standards. And the whole event had the legal integrity of a reality TV show, except people actually died at the end instead of just losing Instagram followers and sponsorship deals with teeth whitening companies. Mark Smeaton, the court musician, was the only one who confessed to adultery with Anne, and his confession came after he was arrested and likely tortured, because nothing produces reliable testimony quite like physical pain and the threat of more physical pain if you don't say what your interrogators want to hear. Smeaton was from a lower social class than the other accused men, which meant he had zero political protection and was basically disposable, making him the perfect candidate to torture into providing the confession that would anchor the entire case against Anne. His supposed affair with the queen was particularly implausible because the class difference between a musician and a queen was so vast that any relationship would have been noticed immediately by literally everyone at court. But plausibility was not a consideration when you're building a case to justify regicide by any other name wrapped in legal proceedings like poison wrapped in chocolate. Henry Norris, the groom of the stool who had the dubious honor of helping Henry VIII with his bathroom needs, was accused of adultery with and based on some flirtatious conversation that was interpreted as proof of an affair, which is like convicting someone of bank robbery because they once said banks have nice architecture. Norris maintained his innocence throughout his imprisonment and refused to confess even when offered a pardon in exchange for admitting guilt, which shows either remarkable integrity or a naive faith that innocence would somehow matter in a system designed to kill him regardless. His refusal to confess was actually inconvenient for the prosecution because they needed confessions to make the case look legitimate, but they executed him anyway because at that point momentum was more important than evidence, and Henry wasn't about to let little details like lack of proof derail his wife replacement operation. William Brereton was a powerful Welsh courtier who'd apparently made enemies through his aggressive land grabbing and general corruption in Wales, which meant his inclusion in the Boleyn case was possibly just a convenient excuse to eliminate him while the executioner was already busy with other tasks, like adding items to your shopping cart when you're already paying for shipping. His alleged affair with and had zero evidence supporting it, but he'd accumulated enough enemies that nobody at court was rushing to his defense, proving that being generally unpopular can get you executed even when the official charges are completely fabricated. His execution was basically a 2-for-1 special where Henry got to destroy and eliminate a problematic courtier simultaneously, which is efficient government if you measure efficiency by body count rather than justice or due process or any other metric civilized societies prefer to use. Francis Weston was a young courtier from a wealthy family who'd been accused based on testimony that he'd told, and he loved her more than his wife, which in the context of courtly love traditions was basically meaningless flattery, but in the context of a show trial became evidence of adultery and treason. Courtly love in the Renaissance was this whole elaborate game where men pretended to worship ladies from afar using flowery language that nobody took literally. Kind of like how we use heart emojis today. Without meaning, we want to actually marry everyone we send them to. But apparently metaphorical declarations of love became literal evidence of affairs when the king needed to kill people. Weston's family tried to buy his freedom, offering enormous sums of money to save him. But Henry refused because accepting bribes to spare someone would undermine the narrative that these men were dangerous traitors rather than convenient scapegoats, and maintaining appearances was more important than money when you're trying to murder your wife with legal cover. George Boleyn, Anne's brother and Viscount Rochford, faced the additional charge of incest with his sister, which was added purely for shock value because regular adultery apparently wasn't scandalous enough, and they needed to make the whole situation seem as depraved as possible to justify the executions. The evidence for this charge was literally nothing. No witnesses, no circumstances, no anything except the testimony of George's wife Jane, who allegedly reported some inappropriate conversations between the siblings, though what exactly she said and whether she was coerced remains debated by historians who probably wish people in the 16th century had taken better notes. The incest charge was so inflammatory that it guaranteed public support for the executions because even people skeptical about the adultery charges would recoil at brother-sister incest, making it the perfect addition to a case that needed emotional impact more than factual support. At his trial, George Boleyn defended himself brilliantly, showing the same intelligence and eloquence that ran in the Boleyn family and probably reminded everyone why they were being executed in the first place. Smart people who can argue their own innocence effectively are dangerous to authoritarian systems that prefer their victims to be confused and compliant. The prosecution made the tactical error of handing George a written document containing allegations that and had questioned Elizabeth's legitimacy and suggested Henry was impotent, expecting him to confirm he'd heard these statements. But instead, George read the allegations aloud in court, which was apparently not the plan because now everyone knew the king was being accused of sexual dysfunction. This courtroom maneuver was either brave or suicidal, depending on your perspective, and it probably sealed George's fate even more firmly than it was already sealed because embarrassing Henry VIII in public by revealing his alleged performance issues was not a survival strategy recommended by any Tudor career counselor. The jury for the men's trial consisted entirely of people who depended on royal favor for their positions and livelihoods, which is like asking the defendant's enemies to serve as impartial judges and expecting justice to somehow emerge from that arrangement. They found all 5 men guilty despite the lack of evidence, condemning them to death with the certainty that comes from knowing your own survival depends on rendering the verdict the king wants to hear. The sentence was hanging, drawing, and quartering for the commoner Smeaton and beheading for the 4 nobles, because even in execution Tudor England maintained strict class distinctions. If you were going to die for crimes you didn't commit, at least you'd die in a manner appropriate to your social status, which is really just class warfare taken to its most grotesquely literal conclusion. Anne's trial 3 days later, on May 15th, followed the same script of predetermined outcomes dressed up as legal proceedings, with the added twist that she was being judged by an assembly that included her own uncle presiding and her former suitor Henry Percy among the jury, which is like having your family and exes serve as judge and jury in your trial for crimes you didn't commit while your husband plans his next wedding in the other room, and entered the court with dignity and composure, answering each charge methodically and pointing out the impossibilities and contradictions in the accusations, like how she supposedly committed adultery on specific dates when she was verifiably elsewhere or pregnant, because apparently the prosecution hadn't bothered to check whether their fictional timeline matched reality before presenting it as fact in a capital case. The charge that Anne had promised to marry Henry Norris after the king's death was presented as evidence of plotting to kill Henry, which is logic so twisted it could win Olympic medals in mental gymnastics. Because apparently saying you'd marry someone if you were theoretically widowed is the same as actively planning to commit murder. By this reasoning, everyone who's ever said, "If I weren't married, I'd date you," should be arrested for conspiracy to commit spousal murder, and dating apps will become evidence-gathering operations for future treason trials. The prosecution needed to establish treason because adultery alone, while a crime for a queen, wouldn't necessarily justify execution. But adultery plus plotting to kill the king definitely would. So they just added the plotting charge without evidence, because why stop at one fabricated accusation when you can have multiple fabricated accusations for the same price? And gave such a compelling defense that several observers later reported being moved by her eloquence and convinced of her innocence. Which in a just system might have mattered, but in this system just made for interesting historical footnotes about how well she argued before they killed her anyway. She maintained her composure throughout the proceedings, neither breaking down in tears, nor showing the kind of hysterical female emotion that the prosecution probably hoped would undermine her credibility, because it understood that even in a rigged trial, maintaining dignity was its own form of resistance. When the guilty verdict was pronounced, and reportedly said she was prepared to die but regretted that innocent men would die because of her, showing more concern for her co-accused than for herself, and generally demonstrating better character in her final days than her husband had shown in his entire reign. The verdicts in both trials were announced before the proceedings even began, with executioners hired and execution dates scheduled before the juries deliberated, which tells you everything you need to know about the legitimacy of these legal proceedings and suggests that maybe calling them trials is too generous and we should use terms like judicial theater or murder with paperwork instead. The whole charade was designed to give Henry VIII legal cover for what was essentially a political execution, allowing him to claim he was a just king forced by law to execute his treasonous wife rather than a tyrant who murdered his spouse because she couldn't produce a male heir and he wanted to remarry. This distinction mattered to Henry's self-image and his reputation both domestically and internationally, because even absolute monarchs care about how they're perceived and prefer to be seen as reluctant enforcers of justice rather than capricious murderers, even when that's exactly what they are. The political machinery behind Anne's execution involved so many people actively participating in or passively enabling judicial murder that it's essentially a case study in how authoritarian systems function when nobody with power wants to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't kill an innocent person just because the king is bored with her, which is a sentence that shouldn't need to be said, but apparently did in 1536 and probably still does in various places today. Thomas Cromwell orchestrated the entire operation with the efficiency of a project manager hitting quarterly targets. Except instead of increasing sales numbers, he was manufacturing treason charges. And his motivation wasn't justice, but political survival, since he'd realized that and had become a liability to both his reformist agenda and his own position at court. Cromwell's ability to construct an entire conspiracy theory, find co-conspirators to accuse, torture at least one confession out of someone, organize 2 trials, and execute 6 people in 17 days shows either remarkable administrative competence or terrifying authoritarian efficiency, depending on whether you value speed over accuracy in your judicial systems. The role of gossip and court intrigue in Anne's downfall cannot be overstated, because Tudor court was basically a pressure cooker of ambitious people confined to close quarters with nothing to do except scheme, flirt, and report on each other's scheming and flirting. Like a reality TV show, if reality TV could get you executed for the entertainment of a paranoid monarch. And had enemies throughout court who resented her rise to power, blamed her for the break with Rome and the destruction of the monasteries, or just disliked her personality because she wasn't demure and submissive like queens were supposed to be according to 16th century gender expectations. These enemies provided the testimonies and circumstantial observations that Cromwell weaponized into charges, taking innocent conversations and courtly flirtations and transforming them into evidence of adultery and treason through the dark magic of motivated reasoning and selective interpretation that would make modern conspiracy theorists look like amateurs. Anne's evangelical Protestant leanings had made her enemies among the conservative Catholic faction at court, who saw her as the architect of England's religious upheaval and blamed her personally for everything from the dissolution of monasteries to the break with papal authority. As if one woman had single-handedly caused the English Reformation rather than being a convenient scapegoat for changes that had complex political, economic, and religious causes. These Catholic courtiers celebrated her downfall as divine justice and spread rumors about her supposed moral depravity to justify their joy at her execution. Because when your political enemy dies horribly, you need a narrative that makes you the good guy rather than someone celebrating judicial murder. The religious dimension of Anne's execution often gets overshadowed by the personal drama of Henry wanting a new wife, but it was absolutely central to why so many powerful people were willing to participate in or enable her destruction without questioning the process. The international dimension of Anne's execution reveals how Tudor England's internal politics affected European power dynamics, because Anne's rise had alienated the Spanish imperial faction that supported Catherine of Aragon, and her fall was celebrated in Spain and Rome as proof that God punishes heretics and homewreckers, which is convenient theology when it aligns with your political interests. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew, had been furious about Anne's marriage to Henry and England's break with Rome, and Anne's execution was seen as potential opening for reconciliation between England and the Habsburg Empire, proving that one woman's judicial murder can be another empire's diplomatic opportunity. The French, who'd been allied with England partly through Anne's French connections and Protestant sympathies, were caught off guard by her sudden fall and had to rapidly recalculate their relationship with Henry VIII, because backing the wrong faction in another country's internal power struggles can have consequences when that faction suddenly gets executed for treason. Jane Seymour's role in Anne's downfall is often portrayed as passive, like she was just standing there being demure and submissive while Henry noticed her. But this narrative erases her agency and the calculated strategy her family employed to position her as Anne's replacement, using the exact same playbook and had used to replace Catherine. Jane refused Henry's advances and gifts while Anne was still queen, maintaining her virtue while keeping Henry interested, which was either genuine religious propriety or an incredibly effective political strategy that her ambitious brothers helped orchestrate, probably both simultaneously, because virtue and ambition aren't mutually exclusive when you're trying to become queen. The Seymour family recognized the pattern of Henry's interest in and waning and positioned Jane as the anti-Anne. Quiet where and was outspoken, submissive where and was assertive, conventionally pious where and was reformist. Basically everything Henry now claimed he wanted after discovering that intelligent women with opinions were less fun when they disagreed with him. The speed with which Henry moved from and to Jane reveals his emotional immaturity and his capacity for self-deception, because he genuinely seems to have convinced himself that Anne had betrayed him with 5 men, including her brother, rather than accepting the simpler explanation that he was a tyrannical narcissist who'd fabricated charges to justify murdering his wife so he could remarry without admitting his religious revolution had been a mistake. Henry rewrote the narrative of his relationship with and transforming himself from obsessed pursuer who'd broken with Rome to marry her into innocent victim seduced by a scheming witch-like woman who'd tricked him into marriage through feminine wiles and possibly witchcraft. Because apparently taking responsibility for your own choices isn't something that happens when you're an absolute monarch with unlimited power and severe personality disorders that nobody can point out without risking their head. The witch allegations against, and while not formally part of the charges at her trial, circulated widely in popular gossip and later chronicles, focusing on her supposed 6th finger or extra nail as evidence of demonic association, because physical differences have always been weaponized as proof of moral or supernatural corruption when society wants to destroy someone. These witch rumors were particularly useful for Henry's reputation management, because they transformed him from a king who'd murdered his wife into a king who'd been deceived by a supernatural force beyond his control, which is essentially the ultimate "it's not me, it's you" defense taken to metaphysical extremes. The fact that Anne had a mole on her neck, possibly a 6th fingernail, and dark hair and eyes, all completely normal physical variations, were reinterpreted as marks of the devil after her death, proving that confirmation bias and motivated reasoning can turn literally anything into evidence when you're committed to destroying someone's reputation posthumously. Anne's evangelical faith and her role in promoting Protestant reform in England became both a source of later admiration from Protestant historians and a convenient target for Catholic critics who portrayed her as a heretic who got her just punishment, showing how religious interpretation of historical events depends entirely on which side of the Reformation you're standing on, and whether you think breaking with Rome was divinely inspired or satanically influenced. Protestant martyrologies later included Anne as a proto-martyr for the cause, somewhat awkwardly, since she wasn't officially executed for religious reasons, but for sexual crimes. But martyrdom is flexible when you need historical figures to support your theological narrative. John Foxe's Acts and Monuments, also known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs, rehabilitated Anne's reputation among Protestants by emphasizing her support for religious reform and downplaying or rejecting the adultery charges, essentially making her a casualty of Catholic conspiracy rather than a victim of her husband's monstrous ego and political calculation. The legal precedent set by Anne's trial was absolutely horrifying because it established that the king could essentially order anyone executed by manufacturing charges and running them through a show trial that provided legal cover for political murder, which is exactly what happened to Catherine Howard 7 years later and to countless others throughout Henry's reign who fell from royal favor. The trial didn't need real evidence, didn't need credible witnesses, didn't need logical consistency. It just needed the king's will and enough frightened or ambitious people willing to participate in the charade, which turned out to be everyone with power, because opposing the king meant joining the condemned. This transformation of law from a check on royal power into a tool for royal murder was one of the most damaging aspects of Henry's reign, creating a climate of fear where anyone could be destroyed at any moment regardless of their actual guilt or innocence if they somehow displeased the king or became politically inconvenient. The psychological toll on everyone involved in orchestrating and executing Anne's judicial murder is rarely discussed, but must have been significant, because these were people who knew they were killing an innocent woman and had to rationalize their participation through some combination of fear, ambition, political necessity, or genuine conviction that they were serving a higher good by removing a disruptive female presence from power. The jurors who voted to convict and the 5 men had to live with those decisions. And while some probably slept fine because they valued their own survival over justice, others must have experienced cognitive dissonance that required elaborate mental gymnastics to resolve, like convincing themselves and really was guilty despite the evidence, or that following the king's will was more important than individual lives, which is how authoritarian systems recruit otherwise normal people into committing atrocities. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury who'd supported and owed his position partly to her influence, wrote a letter to Henry expressing sorrow about Anne's supposed crimes, while carefully avoiding directly proclaiming her innocence or guilt, threading the needle between loyalty to and survival under Henry with the skill of someone who understood that too much support for a condemned woman could make him the next target. Cranmer had to perform the additional degrading task of annulling Henry and Anne's marriage just days before her execution, declaring that their marriage had never been valid, which made Elizabeth officially illegitimate, but also raised the awkward question of how and could have committed adultery against Henry if they'd never been legally married in the first place. A logical contradiction that everyone politely ignored because consistency was less important than giving Henry whatever legal fiction he currently needed. This annulment was peak Henry VIII logic. The marriage was simultaneously real enough that and could be executed for adultery and treason against her husband, but also fake enough to be retroactively erased, proving that when you're an absolute monarch, contradictions aren't problems, they're just different aspects of your absolute will that don't need to make sense to anyone else. The 17 days between Anne's arrest on May 2nd and her execution on May 19th, 1536, must have felt like 17 years compressed into a nightmare, where every hour brought new revelations about how thoroughly the entire system was committed to killing her regardless of truth, justice, or basic human decency. Like being trapped in a horror movie where you're the only person who realizes it's a horror movie and everyone else is following the script enthusiastically. And was held in the royal apartments at the Tower of London under constant surveillance by Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, who reported her every word and action back to Thomas Cromwell, because apparently even when you're about to be executed for treason, the government needs to monitor whether you might say something incriminating, as if adding more charges at that point would make the execution somehow more justified than it already wasn't. Kingston's letters to Cromwell about Anne's behavior in the Tower reveal a woman oscillating between composure and breakdown, which is completely understandable when you're innocent, but everyone with power has decided you're guilty and your execution date is approaching like a deadline you can't possibly meet or escape. And asked repeatedly about the men accused with her, whether they'd be executed, and expressed horror that innocent people would die because of false charges against her, showing more concern for the collateral damage of her own frame-up than most people would manage while facing their own imminent death. She also made several remarks that have puzzled historians, including joking about her situation and laughing at inappropriate moments, which was either a coping mechanism for unbearable stress, a sign of psychological breakdown under pressure, or Justin's personality maintaining her sense of humor even when facing execution, because some people respond to existential terror with gallows humor literally. Anne's conversations in the Tower were manipulated by Kingston and her attendants to try to extract information that could be used against her or the accused men, turning her captivity into an extended interrogation disguised as concerned companionship, which is psychological warfare masquerading as hospitality. Her ladies-in-waiting during this period were chosen specifically because they were hostile to her or loyal to the king rather than to Anne, ensuring that everything she said would be reported and potentially twisted into incriminating evidence, making her imprisonment simultaneously physical and social isolation from anyone who might actually support her. This level of paranoia and control over a condemned prisoner suggests that despite the confidence of the guilty verdicts, Cromwell and Henry were still worried and might somehow escape, or that public opinion might turn in her favor if she mounted an effective defense. So they needed every possible piece of information to use against her, and every conversation monitored for potential threats to the official narrative. Anne's religious preparation for death took up much of her time in the Tower, with prayer and conversation with the almoner who attended her, and she repeatedly swore on the sacrament that she was innocent of the charges, which was either genuine spiritual preparation or a calculated move to make her innocence clear, since swearing on the sacrament was considered the most binding oath possible, and lying would damn your immortal soul, according to Christian theology. The religious context of Tudor England made these oaths meaningful in ways modern secular audiences sometimes miss, and genuinely believe she was about to face divine judgment immediately after execution. So swearing her innocence on the sacrament wasn't just a legal strategy, but a spiritual statement that she was willing to bet her eternal soul on her truthfulness. The fact that she maintained her innocence under these circumstances, when lying would have no earthly benefit and would risk eternal damnation, is pretty compelling evidence that she actually was innocent. But again, evidence didn't matter when the king had already decided on the outcome. The question of whether and should have confessed to crimes she didn't commit in hopes of saving her life or securing better treatment for her daughter Elizabeth is one that historians debate, though it's fundamentally an impossible choice where every option was terrible, and judging her decisions from 500 years later with zero personal stakes is easier than it would have been in the actual moment. Some convicted prisoners in Tudor England did confess, falsely hoping for mercy or pardons, and occasionally this strategy worked. But Anne was shrewd enough to understand that Henry wanted her dead, not imprisoned, and that confessing would merely validate the charges without saving her life, while also permanently destroying her reputation and Elizabeth's legitimacy. By maintaining her innocence, and at least preserve the possibility that future generations might question the charges and rehabilitate her reputation, which is exactly what happened even though it took centuries, proving that sometimes the long game of historical reputation is all you can play when the short game of immediate survival is rigged against you. Anne's request for the French executioner from Calais instead of the traditional English executioner with an axe has been interpreted various ways. as Henry showing mercy by granting her a quicker death, as in having some residual influence even in her final days, or as Henry wanting the execution done professionally, because a botched beheading would be terrible publicity, and he was already dealing with enough international criticism over the situation. The sword method was considered more humane than the axe because a skilled swordsman could decapitate someone in one clean stroke, while the axe sometimes required multiple blows. And there are several documented cases of botched axe executions where prisoners suffered horribly through multiple strikes, making the sword a premium execution method if you're wealthy or important enough to afford the upgrade, which is a sentence that sounds insane but accurately describes Tudor capital punishment. Economics. The symbolism of and being executed on Tower Green, rather than the more public Tower Hill, where the 5 men were executed, has generated extensive analysis about whether this was mercy, discretion, or an attempt to minimize public sympathy for her by limiting the audience. Executing and semi-privately meant fewer witnesses to report on her final words or behavior, giving the government more control over the narrative of her death and preventing her from making any dramatic final statement that might undermine the official version of events or inspire public sympathy. On the other hand, being executed within the tower rather than on public display was considered a privilege reserved for royalty and high nobility. So it maintained Anne's status even in death, while also acknowledging that a public execution of a queen might generate unpredictable crowd reactions ranging from sympathy to celebration, neither of which Henry wanted to deal with when he was trying to present this whole situation as reluctant justice rather than political murder. The execution itself was scheduled for the morning of May 19th, and was reportedly told it would happen at noon, which meant she spent hours in agonized waiting that turned out to be unnecessary because the actual execution happened at 9 in the morning. Though whether this was intentional psychological torture or just poor communication is unclear. This kind of uncertainty about execution timing was common and incredibly cruel, keeping condemned prisoners in sustained terror about when death would actually arrive, which is torture disguised as administrative flexibility and suggests that the cruelty was a feature rather than a bug of the execution process. And reportedly said she thought she'd have more time to prepare and make peace with God, showing that even expecting to die that day, she wasn't mentally ready for it to happen so quickly, because nobody is ever really ready to be murdered by the state for crimes they didn't commit regardless of how much spiritual preparation they've attempted. Anne's famous last words about having a little neck were probably an attempt at humor to cope with terror, because joking about your imminent decapitation is either the bravest or most psychologically dissociated thing anyone could do in that situation, and possibly both simultaneously. She gave a speech before her execution that followed the formula expected of condemned prisoners, not directly contradicting the charges, praising the king, asking for prayers, basically following the script of a proper execution while carefully avoiding saying anything that would further endanger her daughter Elizabeth or other family members who might face repercussions if and when off script in her final moments. The constraints on what and could say even in her last speech show how thoroughly she was controlled even unto death, denied the freedom to proclaim her innocence clearly or condemn the injustice being done to her, because even dying she had to protect those she'd leave behind from royal retaliation. The presence of witnesses at Anne's execution included various courtiers and officials who needed to verify that the sentence had been carried out properly, turning her death into a bureaucratic requirement that had to be witnessed and documented like any other government function, except infinitely more gruesome and personally devastating to the person being executed. These witnesses watched a 30-something woman kneel and get beheaded, then went about their days and probably had lunch afterward, because life continues even after witnessing judicial murder, and people are remarkably good at compartmentalizing horror when they need to function in systems that regularly produce horror. Some witnesses later reported being moved by Anne's dignity and composure, but this sympathy didn't translate into anyone actually trying to stop the execution or challenging its legitimacy, proving that emotional response without action is just spectating with feelings attached. The executioner's professional skill meant Anne's death was probably as quick and painless as decapitation can be, which is damning with the faintest praise imaginable, because we're essentially saying At least the judicial murder was performed competently, which is not the comfort anyone would want when being killed by their government for crimes they didn't commit. The executioner was paid pound 23.6 S.8d for his work, which was a substantial sum that reflects both the technical skill required and the high-profile nature of the job, turning Anne's death into a transaction where someone was financially compensated for killing a queen, which is capitalism meeting capital punishment in the most literal way possible. After the execution, the executioner and witnesses dispersed. Anne's body was gathered up with minimal ceremony and placed in that arrow chest that had to serve as a coffin, because nobody had planned appropriately, and life at court continued with barely a pause, because when you've normalized judicial murder as a tool of statecraft, individual deaths become just another day at the office. The immediate aftermath of Anne's execution saw Henry VIII propagandists working overtime to justify what had happened and to present the king as a wise ruler who'd reluctantly executed his treasonous wife rather than a tyrant who'd murdered an inconvenient spouse. Because public relations mattered even in the 16th century, and the story you tell about your actions is almost as important as the actions themselves. Chronicles and official documents carefully shaped the narrative to emphasize Anne's supposed crimes while minimizing or ignoring the lack of evidence, the impossible timelines, and the obvious political motivations behind the charges, creating an official version of events that historians would spend centuries trying to unpack and deconstruct. This propaganda was largely successful in the short term, with many people accepting the official narrative either because they believed it, because questioning it was dangerous, or because they never liked in any way and were happy to believe the worst about her regardless of evidence, proving that confirmation bias and motivated reasoning work just as well in the 16th century as they do today when people want to believe something that aligns with their existing prejudices. The immediate political consequences of Anne's execution rippled through English court and European politics like a stone thrown into a pond. Except the stone was a woman's severed head, and the ripples were terrified courtiers recalculating their survival strategies, while foreign ambassadors frantically wrote reports trying to explain to their monarchs what the hell just happened in England, and whether Henry VIII was now completely unhinged or just operating at his normal level of tyrannical unpredictability. Within days of Anne's death, Henry married Jane Seymour in a ceremony that was quieter than his previous weddings, probably because even Henry recognized that throwing a massive celebration 11 days after executing your previous wife was bad optics, even by Tudor standards. Though not bad enough to actually wait a reasonable mourning period or reflect on whether murdering your spouse indicated some personal issues that should be addressed before remarrying immediately. Jane Seymour's family, the Seymours, rose to prominence on the foundation of Anne's execution, which meant their entire political fortune was literally built on judicial murder. And they needed Henry to stay committed to the narrative that, and had been guilty, because if he ever admitted she was innocent, their position would collapse faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. Edward Seymour and Thomas Seymour, Jane's brothers, became increasingly powerful at court and eventually would play major roles in the next reign, proving that being related to the king's wife was the ultimate career accelerator in Tudor England, even when that relationship was established through your sister replacing an executed queen. The Seymours had to walk a careful line of celebrating their rise without appearing to celebrate Anne's death too obviously, which is a delicate political dance that requires pretending your good fortune is completely unrelated to someone else's judicial murder while everyone knows exactly how you got where you are. The conservative Catholic faction at court celebrated Anne's fall as a victory and hoped that with her gone, Henry might reconcile with Rome and reverse the Protestant reform she'd championed, which shows they fundamentally misunderstood Henry's motivations because he hadn't broken with Rome for Anne. He'd used and as an excuse to break with Rome for political and financial reasons that had nothing to do with any individual woman. These Catholic courtiers were disappointed to discover that Anne's execution didn't mean a return of papal authority, because Henry liked being supreme head of the Church of England and having control over church property and income way too much to give that up, just because the woman who'd catalyzed the break was now dead. The dissolution of the monasteries continued, Protestant reforms proceeded, and the Catholics realized too late that, and have been a scapegoat rather than the actual cause of England's religious transformation, making their celebration of her death a premature victory lap for a game they were still losing. Thomas Cromwell emerged from the Boleyn affair with his power intact and actually enhanced, having proved his ruthless efficiency at solving the king's problems through judicial murder, which is exactly the kind of resume-building achievement that works great right up until you become the problem the king wants solved. Cromwell continued implementing Protestant reforms and consolidating royal power for 4 more years. But his experience with and should have taught him that being useful to Henry VIII was temporary, while being expendable was permanent. A lesson he apparently didn't internalize sufficiently, since he ended up executed in 1540 using the same playbook of fabricated charges and show trials that he'd perfected on Anne. The poetic justice of Cromwell's eventual fall is so obvious that even contemporaries noticed it, proving that karma in Tudor politics might be delayed, but eventually shows up like a bill you forgot about until it arrives with late fees and interest. Anne's family, the Boleyns, were destroyed by her execution in ways that went beyond her individual death. Because when you're accused of treason, your entire family becomes tainted by association, and everyone who'd allied with you suddenly develops amnesia about ever supporting you. Thomas Boleyn, Anne's father, who'd spent decades climbing the social ladder, using his daughters as rungs, lost his positions at court and died a few years later a broken man whose ambitions had literally gotten his 2 children executed, George on the scaffold and by the sword, which is arguably the universe's way of saying that treating your children as investment vehicles for your social advancement is a strategy with potentially catastrophic downsides. Mary Boleyn, Anne's sister who'd been Henry's mistress before and became queen, wisely disappeared from court and married a commoner, choosing obscurity and survival over status and danger, which was probably the smartest decision any Boleyn made during the entire saga. Elizabeth, Anne's 3-year-old daughter, became the most significant long-term consequence of the execution, though nobody realized it in 1536, when she was just a bastardized toddler whose mother had been beheaded for treason and whose father had declared her illegitimate, which is absolutely the worst possible start to life and would give anyone enough material for decades of therapy if therapy existed in the 16th century. Elizabeth was removed from the succession, lost her title of princess, and was raised in relative obscurity with uncertain status and minimal resources, bounced between households and guardians who weren't sure how to treat the illegitimate daughter of an executed traitor who was still technically the king's daughter. The psychological impact of knowing your father had your mother executed and then declared you illegitimate must have been absolutely devastating. Yet Elizabeth eventually turned that trauma into the foundation for one of the most successful reigns in English history, which is either inspiring or horrifying, depending on whether you think childhood trauma should be required for great leadership. The question of what Elizabeth knew or was told about her mother's death and the charges against her is murky. But she grew up in a court where everyone knew the story, and many people believed the official version that Anne was guilty, meaning Elizabeth spent her formative years surrounded by people who thought her mother was an adulterous traitor who'd slept with 5 men, including her own brother. The impact of this on Elizabeth's psychology, her lifelong refusal to marry, her complicated relationship with sexuality and intimacy, and her political strategies of delay and deflection have all been analyzed by historians who see connections between her mother's fate and her own behavior. Though drawing direct causal lines is always speculative when you're psychoanalyzing someone who died over 400 years ago and left no therapy notes. What's undeniable is that Elizabeth learned from her mother's execution that queens who couldn't control their husbands or produce heirs were disposable. And that lesson informed her entire approach to power when she eventually became queen herself. The international reaction to Anne's execution ranged from celebration in Catholic Spain and Rome to confusion and concern in Protestant regions in France, with most foreign observers recognizing the charges as probably fabricated but unable to do anything about it, because interfering in another country's internal affairs risked war, and Henry VIII was volatile enough that criticizing his decision to execute his wife might lead to diplomatic rupture or worse. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who'd hated and for replacing his Aunt Catherine, saw her death as divine justice, but was also reportedly disturbed by the method of her removal, because even by 16th century standards, executing your wife for fabricated adultery charges seemed excessive and set a bad precedent for how monarchs could treat their spouses. The French, who'd been allied with England and had connections to, and through her years at the French court, were caught in an awkward position of needing to maintain diplomatic relations with Henry, while also processing the fact that their ally had just murdered his wife using transparently false charges, which made future negotiations complicated when you're never quite sure if the person you're negotiating with is a rational actor or a homicidal narcissist having a bad day. The popular reaction in England was mixed, with many people who'd never liked, and because she replaced the beloved Catherine of Aragon feeling that she'd gotten what she deserved, while others recognized the charges as absurd and were horrified by the judicial murder, but kept their mouths shut, because criticizing the king's decisions publicly was an excellent way to join and on the executioner's schedule. The speed and brutality of Anne's fall from queen to executed traitor in 17 days shocked even contemporaries who were used to political volatility, because that timeline barely allowed for processing what was happening before it was over, like watching a car crash in slow motion, except it's actually happening at high speed, and by the time you realize what you're seeing, it's already finished. Some people genuinely believed and was guilty because they couldn't imagine the king and all his ministers would lie about something so serious, which shows touching faith in governmental honesty that was misplaced then and would be misplaced now, while others suspected the truth but decided that survival meant accepting the official narrative and moving on with their lives. The religious reformers who'd seen and, as a patron and protector, faced a crisis when she was executed, because her fall could have signaled a reversal of Protestant reforms and a return to Catholic orthodoxy. But instead, Henry continued the reforms while simply replacing and with a more religiously conservative Jane Seymour, proving that the Reformation in England was about royal supremacy and money rather than theology or any individual's religious convictions. Protestant preachers had to perform complicated rhetorical gymnastics to explain how, and could have been both a supporter of true religion and a guilty traitor, or alternatively to suggest that she'd been martyred by Catholic conspirators, depending on which narrative best served their purposes and kept them from being arrested for questioning royal justice. The fact that the same execution could be interpreted as evidence of Anne's guilt, proof of Catholic conspiracy, or demonstration of God's judgment against heresy shows how flexible historical interpretation becomes when people need events to confirm their existing worldview rather than challenging it. Anne's execution established a template that Henry would use again with Catherine Howard 7 years later. Accusations of adultery, rapid trial, execution, immediate remarriage, and historical rehabilitation of the king as the wrong party rather than the murderer. This pattern shows that Anne's death wasn't an aberration, but the establishment of a precedent, a debugging of the wife removal process that Henry would deploy again when convenient, which transforms her execution from tragic anomaly in a standard operating procedure for a tyrant who'd learned that murdering your wife was easier than admitting you made a mistake. Catherine Howard's execution in 1542 followed the same script, but with even less pretense of legitimacy, since the charges against Catherine were actually somewhat more credible than those against, and yet the process was identical down to the rapid timeline and the lack of actual due process, proving that once you've successfully murdered one wife, using judicial means the second time is just muscle memory and institutional knowledge being applied efficiently. The long-term impact of Anne's execution on English monarchy and politics was profound because it demonstrated that queens were ultimately just as vulnerable to royal displeasure as any other courtier despite their elevated status, which made being queen considerably less appealing and more dangerous than it appeared from outside. Future queens and potential queens had to navigate the knowledge that marriage to the king could end not just in divorce, but in execution if you failed to provide what was required or lost royal favor, which is relationship pressure taken to its most extreme conclusion and probably explains why several eligible women tried to avoid marrying Henry VIII later in his reign, preferring spinsterhood to potential beheading. The precedent also established that Parliament and the courts would rubber stamp whatever charges the king brought regardless of evidence, transforming law from a constraint on royal power into a tool for royal will, which was a fundamental shift in English governance that wouldn't be reversed until after the Tudor period ended and subsequent monarchs proved less homicidal in their personal relationships. And Boleyn's legacy is complicated by the fact that she's simultaneously remembered as a victim of judicial murder, a homewrecker who destroyed Catherine of Aragon's life, a religious reformer who advanced Protestantism in England, and the mother of Elizabeth I, which means everyone from feminists to Catholics to Anglicans to historians of Tudor fashion has claimed her for their own narrative purposes, like she's a historical Rorschach test where you see whatever confirms your existing beliefs about women, power, and what happens when you threaten male authority. The rehabilitation of her reputation took centuries and required multiple waves of historical revision as standards for evidence and attitudes toward women changed, transforming her from the adulteress and traitor of contemporary accounts to the innocent victim of tyranny in modern historiography. Though this rehabilitation is still incomplete, because some people remain committed to believing she was guilty despite the overwhelming evidence that the charges were fabricated by people who had everything to gain from her death. The Victorian era saw the beginning of Anne's rehabilitation when historians started seriously questioning the charges against her and recognizing that a trial orchestrated by the husband who wanted to remarry might not have been the most reliable source of truth about his wife's fidelity, which seems obvious in retrospect, but apparently took 300 years for people to consider seriously. Victorian writers were torn between sympathy for Anne as a wronged woman and discomfort with her role in destroying Catherine of Aragon's marriage, creating portrayals that oscillated between tragic heroine and ambitious seductress, depending on the writer's attitudes toward female agency and Catholic versus Protestant sympathies. These Victorian portrayals established many of the tropes that still dominate popular understanding of Anne: the doomed romance with Henry, the jealous rivalry with Catherine, the tragic fall from power, all rendered with the melodrama and moral judgment characteristic of 19th century historical writing that needed everyone to fit into clear categories of innocent victim or guilty villain with minimal room for complexity. The feminist reclamation of Anne Boleyn in the 20th and 21st centuries has positioned her as a woman punished for having intelligence, ambition, and agency in a patriarchal system that demanded female submission, transforming her from individual historical figure into a symbol of how societies destroy women who refuse to conform to gender expectations. This interpretation has merit because Anne was literally executed for failing to provide a male heir, which wasn't biologically her fault, and for allegedly committing adultery, which she didn't do, meaning she was killed for things either beyond her control or completely fabricated, which is pretty much the definition of patriarchal injustice. However, the feminist rehabilitation sometimes glosses over Anne's own participation in destroying Catherine of Aragon and her willingness to use her sexuality strategically to achieve power, as if acknowledging these complexities would somehow undermine her status as victim, when really it just makes her more human and historically accurate than hagiography allows. Popular culture's obsession with Anne Boleyn has produced countless novels, films, television series, and even a musical, making her one of the most portrayed figures in historical fiction despite her relatively short time as queen and the fact that she's been dead for nearly 500 years, which suggests that stories about powerful women getting destroyed by men who can't handle them have eternal appeal regardless of historical period. These portrayals range from relatively accurate historical dramas to complete fantasies that use Anne's name while inventing entirely fictional personalities and motivations, creating a weird situation where the fictional and is often more famous than the historical, and most people's understanding of her comes from entertainment rather than history books. The 2008 musical Six reimagined Henry VIII Wives as a pop girl group, with and getting a sassy, self-aware number about her execution that turns tragedy into empowerment anthem, which is either brilliantly subversive reclamation of historical trauma or deeply inappropriate, depending on your tolerance for making Broadway entertainment out of judicial murder. The debate over Anne's appearance continues to fascinate people in ways that reveal more about our current obsession with female appearance than anything about 16th century beauty standards. Because we have no verified portraits of and painted during her lifetime, and descriptions of her looks vary wildly from not the most beautiful to she had a certain attractiveness, which are the kind of backhanded compliments that tell you more about the describer's biases than the subject's actual appearance. The famous Hever Castle portrait labeled as in Boleyn probably isn't her, and most of the portraits we associate with her were painted long after her death based on copies of lost originals or complete fabrications, meaning our mental image of Anne Boleyn is largely fictional and constructed from 500 years of artists imagining what she might have looked like based on descriptions filtered through multiple political agendas. The obsession with whether Anne was beautiful enough to justify Henry's obsession with her reveals the depressing assumption that women's historical significance depends on their attractiveness, as if being executed by your husband requires meeting certain aesthetic standards to be taken seriously as a historical tragedy. Anne's role in bringing about the English Reformation is simultaneously overstated and understated depending on who's doing the analysis, because she definitely encouraged Protestant reforms and protected reformist preachers, but she didn't single-handedly cause Henry to break with Rome, since he had plenty of political and financial motivations independent of his desire to marry her. The myth that Henry created the Church of England just to marry and reduces a complex political, religious, and economic transformation to a romantic narrative about a king's obsession, which is easier to understand than explaining the actual complicated factors involved, but also fundamentally misleading about how historical change happens, and was a catalyst and a convenient excuse rather than the sole cause, which makes her important but not responsible for everything that happened. Yet both Catholic writers who want to blame someone for the Reformation and Protestant writers who want a heroine for their cause have found it useful to exaggerate her influence in opposite directions. The mother-daughter dynamic between Anne and Elizabeth I is one of the most poignant aspects of the story because they barely knew each other, yet Anne's execution shaped Elizabeth's entire life and reign in ways both obvious and subtle, creating a connection across death that influenced English history for decades after Anne died. Elizabeth reportedly kept a ring with miniature portraits of herself and that she wore, suggesting she honored her mother's memory privately, even though publicly acknowledging and too enthusiastically would mean contradicting the official narrative of her guilt, which shows the impossible position Elizabeth was in regarding her mother's legacy. When Elizabeth became queen in 1558, she didn't officially rehabilitate or declare her innocent, probably because doing so would mean admitting her father was a murderous tyrant which would undermine royal authority and her own legitimacy. But she promoted people who'd been loyal to and generally signaled through her actions that she knew her mother had been wronged, even if she couldn't say so explicitly. Elizabeth's famous virginity and refusal to marry has been extensively analyzed as a response to her mother's fate, with historians suggesting that Elizabeth saw marriage as a trap that cost queens their independence and potentially their lives, making spinsterhood look infinitely preferable to risking the kind of marriage that had killed her mother and nearly destroyed her half-sister Mary. Elizabeth's often-quoted statement that she was married to England and needed no other husband was partly political strategy, but also possibly genuine conviction that marriage meant submission to male authority in ways that would compromise her power and potentially her survival, which are completely reasonable concerns when your father executed 2 wives and your mother was one of them. The fact that Elizabeth became one of England's greatest monarchs while remaining unmarried and without producing an heir suggests that maybe the Tudor obsession with male heirs and dynasty building through marriage was overrated, though of course Elizabeth's success doesn't erase the very real dangers childless female monarchs face from succession crises and foreign threats. The location of Anne's execution and burial at the Tower of London has become a pilgrimage site for tourists who want to connect with this historical tragedy, which means Anne's death has been transformed into a commodity that generates revenue for British tourism, proving that capitalism will monetize absolutely anything, including judicial murder, if you wait long enough and build a gift shop nearby. The Chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula Ware and is buried has a memorial marker on the floor, identifying her resting place along with other executed Tudor prisoners, creating a strange situation where people take selfies near the grave of a woman who was beheaded, which is either disrespectful or just how modern tourism works when historical tragedy becomes Instagram content. The Tower of London promotes its execution history as a major attraction, with guided tours explaining how various famous people were killed there, transforming the site of state murder in a family entertainment that somehow manages to be educational and creepy simultaneously. The medical speculation about Anne's miscarriages and whether she had some underlying condition that prevented her from carrying male pregnancies to term has occupied historians and medical professionals who retroactively diagnose people who died 500 years ago based on fragmentary evidence, which is either fascinating historical detective work or completely pointless speculation, depending on your tolerance for unfalsifiable hypotheses about dead people's health conditions. Some researchers have suggested and might have had a rhesus blood type incompatibility with Henry that would cause progressively worse pregnancy outcomes, while others have proposed everything from stress-induced miscarriages to specific genetic conditions, all of which are completely unprovable but make for interesting articles in medical journals that probably don't change our understanding of the historical events significantly. What these medical speculations do accomplish is removing some of the blame from and for failing to produce a son by suggesting biological factors beyond anyone's control, which is useful for rehabilitation purposes, but also slightly misses the point that she shouldn't have been blamed regardless of whether medical conditions were involved, since blaming women for their pregnancy outcomes is ridiculous whether or not underlying pathology exists. The counterfactual question of what would have happened if, and had produced a surviving son occupies alternate history enthusiasts who like to imagine timelines where, and remains queen, Henry doesn't execute her, and English history proceeds completely differently, which is entertaining speculation but ultimately impossible to answer, since changing one variable would cascade into countless other changes that quickly make prediction meaningless. Presumably if, and had a son, she would have survived at least until the child was old enough that killing her wouldn't risk the succession. Though given Henry's pattern of behavior with Jane Seymour, who did give him a son and still got replaced by 3 more wives after she died in childbirth. Maybe, and would have eventually been discarded anyway, through different means once Henry grew bored or found another woman he wanted to marry. The fact that Jane Seymour is remembered more positively than, and despite Jane also failing to give Henry the lasting dynasty he wanted, since Edward VI died young and childless, shows that success in Henry's eyes was temporary and ultimately nobody could give him what he wanted, because what he wanted was impossible and his expectations were unreasonable to the point of being disconnected from biological and political reality. The parallels between and Boleyn's situation and modern celebrity culture are striking when you consider how quickly public opinion can turn against women in the public eye, how female success is often attributed to sexuality rather than ability, and how women who challenge male power structures face coordinated campaigns to destroy their reputations using whatever accusations will stick regardless of truth. And went from praise queen to executed traitor in 17 days through a combination of political conspiracy, weaponized gossip, and a powerful man deciding she was disposable, which sounds uncomfortably similar to how modern women in politics, entertainment, or business could be destroyed through coordinated media campaigns, sexual allegations, and character assassination that may or may not have any relationship to truth, but definitely serve someone's interests. The main difference is that modern women usually don't literally lose their heads, just their careers, reputations, and sometimes their mental health, which is an improvement, but not as much of an improvement as we'd like to think when the underlying dynamics of destroying powerful women remain remarkably consistent across 5 centuries. The historiographical evolution of Anne Boleyn's story reveals how each generation has essentially used her as a canvas to paint their own anxieties about women, power, sexuality, and justice, transforming a 16th century queen into whatever symbolic figure contemporary society needs her to be, which means there are approximately 17 different Anne Boleyns, depending on whether you're reading Catholic propaganda from 1540 Victorian Moral Tales from 1880, Feminist Reclamations from 1980, or TikTok History Explainers from 2024. The immediate post-execution chronicles written during Henry VIII's lifetime portrayed and as guilty because questioning the official narrative while Henry was alive and capable of executing you for disagreeing with him was a survival strategy rather than historical methodology, creating a foundation of hostile sources that historians spent centuries trying to deconstruct and contextualize. These early accounts emphasized Anne's supposed sexual crimes and her alleged plotting against Henry, establishing a narrative that she was a dangerous woman who'd seduced the king and then betrayed him, which served Henry's propaganda needs perfectly and also conveniently blamed and for the religious upheaval rather than holding Henry accountable for his own decisions. Catholic historians and propagandists had particularly strong motivations to portray Anne negatively because she symbolized the Protestant Reformation that had destroyed papal authority in England, making her a useful villain whose supposed crimes could justify Catholic opposition to the religious changes and suggest that breaking with Rome led inevitably to moral corruption and divine punishment. Nicholas Sanders' 1585 account described Anne as having 6 fingers, large cysts, and a projecting tooth, essentially turning her into a physical monster to match her supposed moral monstrosity. Because apparently when you're trying to convince people someone deserved execution, you might as well add some horror movie aesthetics to make the story more compelling. These Catholic accounts influenced European understanding of Anne for generations, creating a version of events where she was the villain who destroyed Catherine of Aragon and corrupted England's religion, which was politically useful for Catholic powers trying to delegitimize Protestant England, but historically unreliable as actual evidence about what happened. Though distinguishing between propaganda and history is apparently something humans struggle with regardless of time period, Protestant historians face the opposite problem of needing and to be innocent and possibly even martyred for the true faith, which required explaining how she could be both a promoter of religious reform and someone executed for sexual crimes without those two facts contradicting each other in ways that undermine the Protestant narrative. John Fox's solution in his Acts and Monuments was to emphasize Anne's religious activities and charitable works while dismissing the adultery charges as Catholic conspiracy, creating a proto-martyr figure who died for supporting true religion rather than for failing to produce a male heir or because her husband wanted to remarry. This Protestant rehabilitation was politically motivated just like the Catholic condemnation, meaning that both sides were using and for propaganda purposes rather than trying to understand what actually happened, which is how most historical figures get treated when they become symbols in religious or political conflicts that outlive them by centuries. The Enlightenment and early modern period saw historians beginning to apply slightly more critical analysis to the sources and questioning whether charges brought by a husband who wanted to remarry should be taken at face value, which seems like obvious methodology, but was actually somewhat revolutionary for historical analysis that had previously accepted official documents as inherently truthful. These historians started noting the impossibilities in the timeline of Anne's supposed affairs, the lack of credible evidence, and the obvious political motivations of everyone involved in her prosecution, building a case for her innocence that wasn't based on religious partisanship, but on actual evaluation of evidence and logical reasoning. However, even these more critical historians often couldn't quite escape the assumption that Anne must have done something to bring about her own downfall, suggesting perhaps she was too outspoken or too ambitious or too something that explained why this happened to her. Because even skeptical male historians apparently needed women to bear some responsibility for their own victimization, rather than admitting that sometimes powerful men just murder inconvenient women for completely unjustifiable reasons. The Romantic period in the 19th century transformed Anne into a tragic romantic heroine, emphasizing the love story between her and Henry while downplaying the political calculation and sexual brinksmanship that characterized their actual relationship, creating a sanitized version where Anne was motivated by true love rather than ambition, and Henry was a passionate lover tragically forced to execute his beloved rather than a narcissistic tyrant who murdered his wife when she stopped being. useful. This romanticization made and more sympathetic, but also less complex and less interesting than the historical reality, reducing an intelligent political operator who played a dangerous game and lost to a passive victim of forces beyond her control who just happened to fall in love with the wrong man. The romantic narrative is easier to consume than the complicated reality where and was simultaneously victim and agent, someone who made strategic choices that backfired catastrophically, but also someone who was genuinely wronged by a system that would have destroyed her regardless of her choices once Henry decided he wanted someone else. 20th century feminist historians rescued and from romantic passivity and restored her agency, portraying her as an intelligent woman navigating impossible circumstances in a patriarchal system that punished female ambition, which is accurate, but also sometimes veers into hagiography that ignores Anne's own participation in court politics and her role in Catherine of Aragon's misery, as if acknowledging complexity would somehow betray the feminist project. These feminist readings emphasized how Anne was punished for behaviors that would have been unremarkable in a man: political ambition, strategic sexuality, intellectual confidence, and how her execution established that queens were ultimately subject to the same patriarchal control as any other woman despite their elevated status. The feminist, Anne is a woman ahead of her time who challenged gender norms and paid with her life, which is inspiring but also somewhat ahistorical since Anne wasn't trying to overthrow patriarchy, but rather to succeed within its rules. And her tragedy is partly that she played the game well enough to become queen, but not well enough to survive once the rules changed. Academic historians in the late 20th and 21st centuries have tried to move beyond both the romantic and feminist narratives to understand, and in her specific historical context, examining the evidence carefully while acknowledging that we'll never know certain things with certainty and that our interpretations are always influenced by contemporary concerns and biases. This more nuanced approach recognizes, and as a complex historical figure who was intelligent and ambitious, who made strategic choices that serve her interests, who promoted religious reform for both conviction and political advantage, and who was ultimately destroyed by forces partly beyond her control in a judicial murder that she definitely didn't deserve regardless of her personal qualities or political choices. Modern academic work on and emphasizes placing her in context of Tudor court culture, religious reform, and gender politics while avoiding both the demonization of early accounts and the sanctification of later rehabilitations. Though achieving balanced historical analysis of someone who became such a powerful cultural symbol is nearly impossible when every description is filtered through layers of interpretation and political meaning. The popular historical fiction industry has produced hundreds of and Boleyn novels ranging from meticulously researched historical recreations to complete fantasies that use Tudor England as aesthetic backdrop for modern romance plots, creating a weird situation where and exists simultaneously as historical figure and fictional character, with the fictional versions often more culturally influential than the historical research. Philippa Gregory's novels popularized a sympathetic version of, and while inventing extensive interior emotional life that we have no evidence for, and Hilary Mantel's Wolf Hall trilogy portrayed, and through Thomas Cromwell's perspective in ways that made her more complex but also more alien and harder to sympathize with, showing how changing perspective transforms the same historical events into completely different stories with different emotional impacts. These fictional Annes have introduced millions of readers to Tudor history and probably inspired more interest in the historical period than any number of academic monographs could achieve. But they also create the problem where people think they know and Boleyn based on novels that are explicitly fiction and then get confused or defensive when historians point out that fictional characterization isn't the same as historical evidence. Television and film portrayals of and have ranged from Genevieve Bujold's fierce, intelligent, and in End of a Thousand Days to Natalie Dormer's manipulative but sympathetic portrayal in The Tudors to the various stage and screen adaptations that have emphasized different aspects of her story, depending on what the production wanted to say about power, gender, or monarchy. These visual portrayals have enormous cultural impact, because most people encounter history through entertainment rather than academic books, meaning that an actress's interpretation of Anne Boleyn in a popular TV series probably shapes more people's understanding of Tudor history than everything professional historians have written combined, which is either depressing or pragmatic, depending on whether you think popular culture should be dismissed or engaged with as a legitimate form of historical transmission. The fact that Anne is always portrayed by conventionally attractive actresses despite historical descriptions suggesting she wasn't a great beauty by the standards of her time shows how even historical dramas can't escape contemporary beauty standards and the assumption that important women must have been beautiful to justify the attention they received. The internet and social media have created new spaces for an Boleyn discourse where amateur historians, enthusiasts, and people with varying levels of knowledge debate her guilt or innocence, her relationship with Henry, and what her story means for contemporary gender politics, sometimes with more heat than light, and frequently with limited attention to actual historical evidence versus fictional portrayals. TikTok historians create 60-second explainers about Anne's execution that reach millions of viewers, but necessarily simplify complex historical situations into dramatic narratives that sacrifice nuance for engagement. While Twitter debates about whether Anne was a homewrecker or a victim generate thousands of responses from people defending or attacking a woman who's been dead for 500 years, as if the argument actually matters to anything beyond our own contemporary political battles. These online discussions often reveal more about current gender politics than about Tudor history, with and becoming a proxy for debates about female ambition, sexual agency, and whether women who break social rules deserve sympathy or condemnation when they face consequences, which are important contemporary questions, but not necessarily the right framework for understanding a 16th century queen's judicial murder. The question of whether we should judge, and by 21st century moral standards, or 16th century ones, produces endless debate among historians and enthusiasts, because judging her by modern standards makes her seem less culpable for things like participating in court intrigue, but also more guilty of being complicit in a system that oppressed women, including Catherine of Aragon. While judging her by contemporary standards makes her strategic choices seem more reasonable, but also makes it harder to condemn her execution as unjust since judicial murder was relatively normal for Tudor political life. The problem with both approaches is that they assume we can cleanly separate our own values from our historical analysis, when really every historical interpretation is inevitably shaped by the interpreter's own context, values, and biases, whether we acknowledge that influence or pretend to pure objectivity. The best historical work probably acknowledges these limitations while still trying to understand, and in her own context, recognizing that we can simultaneously understand why she made certain choices given her circumstances, and still conclude that some things that happened to her were wrong regardless of historical context, because some things are wrong in any era, even if they were considered normal at the time. The commercialization of Anne Boleyn through tourism, merchandise, and entertainment has transformed a human tragedy into a brand that generates revenue through books, tours, documentaries, and apparently everything from coffee mugs to tote bags featuring her image or famous quotes, which is either tasteless commodification of judicial murder or just how historical memory works in capitalist societies that turn everything, including death, into consumable products. You can buy Anne Boleyn jewelry, clothing, collectibles, and memorabilia that let you literally wear your interest in a woman who was beheaded, which when you think about it is deeply weird, but also somehow perfectly normal in a culture that decorates homes with replicas of medieval torture devices and thinks dungeons are fun party themes. The Tower of London gift shop sells and Boleyn-themed items next to children's activity books about the tower, creating this surreal juxtaposition where a site of actual state murder has been transformed in a family entertainment and shopping destination, proving that humans are remarkably good at sanitizing horror when there's money to be made from historical tourism. The academic field of Tudor studies has produced thousands of books and articles about Anne Boleyn, analyzing everything from her religious beliefs to her fashion choices to her influence on English politics, creating a massive body of scholarship that most people will never read, but that shapes how and is portrayed in popular histories and media adaptations that reach wider audiences. Historians continue debating minute details of Anne's life and death. What she wore to her execution, her exact words on a scaffold, whether particular documents should be attributed to her or are forgeries, with the intensity usually reserved for major historical controversies. Because when someone becomes this symbolically important, every detail matters, and every interpretation has implications for larger arguments about gender, power, and justice. The fact that we're still writing about Boleyn 500 years after her death, and still finding new things to say or new angles to explore suggests either that she was genuinely historically significant or that we're collectively obsessed with women who challenge power and were destroyed for it. And probably both things are true simultaneously. Looking at Boleyn's story from our contemporary vantage point in 2025 reveals both how much has changed in 500 years regarding women's rights, legal protections, and marriage dynamics, and also how disturbingly little has changed about the fundamental ways societies destroy women who challenge male power, fail to meet expectations, or simply become inconvenient to people with more authority and resources than they have. We like to think we've progressed beyond the days when husbands could have their wives executed for fabricated crimes. And legally speaking, that's absolutely true in most democracies, where judicial systems theoretically operate independently of personal vendettas and provide actual due process. But the underlying dynamics of powerful men destroying women who threaten or disappoint them continue in forms adapted to modern legal and social frameworks that make the violence less literal, but not necessarily less devastating to the women experiencing it. The modern equivalents of Anne's destruction don't involve swords or scaffolds, but rather coordinated media campaigns, legal warfare through custody battles and divorce proceedings, professional blacklisting, reputation destruction through social media, and the weaponization of legal systems that are supposed to provide justice, but can be manipulated by people with sufficient resources and motivation to destroy their targets. Women in high-profile divorces from wealthy, powerful men face character assassination that would make Thomas Cromwell nod with professional appreciation, with accusations of infidelity, gold digging, mental instability, and bad motherhood deployed strategically regardless of truth to justify why these women deserve to lose everything, including sometimes their children and their reputations. The tools have changed from show trials to tabloid journalism and strategic leaking to media outlets. But the fundamental pattern of destroying a woman's credibility and safety because a powerful man wants her gone remains recognizable across 5 centuries, which is depressing but also useful for understanding that Anne's story isn't ancient history, but rather a historical example of patterns that continue today in modified forms. If Boleyn existed today and the same basic dynamics played out, ambitious woman marries powerful man, fails to give him the son he demands, he wants to remarry. She'd probably face a divorce rather than execution, but that divorce would likely involve extensive litigation, accusations of adultery whether true or not, fighting over custody of Elizabeth, leaked stories to tabloids about her supposed instability or infidelity, and strategic deployment of resources and legal expertise to ensure. She lost status, money, and possibly access to her child. The modern Henry VIII wouldn't need to fabricate treason charges because family courts and public opinion can destroy women effectively without criminal prosecution, using civil proceedings that technically follow legal rules but can be manipulated by wealthy litigants who can afford better lawyers and longer legal battles than their opponents, and would probably write a memoir afterward that would be dismissed as bitter ex-wife score settling regardless of its accuracy. Because women who tell their stories about powerful men who wronged them face reflexive skepticism that their male counterparts rarely experience, proving that credibility gaps based on gender survive even when we think we've achieved equality. The modern obsession with whether and was really guilty despite overwhelming evidence she wasn't reflects our contemporary struggles with believing women's testimony about their own experiences, especially when those experiences involve powerful men behaving badly. Because the same doubt and demand for perfect evidence that we see in historical debates about and appear constantly in modern discussions about allegations of abuse, harassment, or misconduct by powerful men. People who should know better still occasionally suggest that maybe and was guilty of something, even if not everything she was charged with, needing her to bear partial responsibility for her own execution the same way modern victims are scrutinized for anything they might have done to provoke or invite the harm they experienced. Because acknowledging that sometimes women are destroyed for no reason other than being inconvenient to powerful men is apparently harder than inventing reasons why. They deserved it. This victim-blaming impulse crosses centuries and manifests, whether we're talking about a 16th century queen or a 21st century woman reporting workplace harassment, suggesting that until we fundamentally change how we assign credibility and blame in gendered power dynamics, we'll keep replicating in Boleyn's story in different contexts with different specifics, but the same underlying pattern. Ann's crime of failing to produce a male heir seems absurdly archaic until you consider modern pressure on women to have children, social judgment of women who can't conceive or choose not to, and the ways women's value is still partially tied to reproductive capacity in cultures worldwide. Even though we theoretically know better and have moved beyond treating women primarily as baby-making machines whose worth depends on their fertility, women facing infertility or pregnancy loss still experience blame, shame, and sometimes relationship breakdown over circumstances often beyond their control. And while their partners don't execute them for it, the emotional and social consequences can be devastating in ways that echo Ann's experience of being discarded for reproductive failure that wasn't actually her fault biologically. The expectation that women's primary value lies in motherhood and that failure to fulfill this role makes them disposable hasn't disappeared, but rather gone underground, operating through social pressure and personal judgment rather than explicit legal requirements, which is progress, but not as much progress as we'd like to think when women are still judged fundamentally by their reproductive choices and outcomes. The speed of Ann's fall, 17 days from arrest to execution, might seem impossible in our era of lengthy legal proceedings. But the modern equivalents of rapid reputation destruction happen constantly through viral social media campaigns where someone can go from respected professional to unemployable pariah in days or even hours based on accusations that may or may not be thoroughly investigated before consequences arrive. Cancel culture, whatever your opinion about its legitimacy or fairness, operates at speeds that would impress Thomas Cromwell, destroying careers and reputations faster than due process can possibly function, which creates situations where people face social and professional execution before facts are established or context is considered. The parallel isn't perfect because social media cancellation isn't the same as literal execution, and conflating them is offensive to actual victims of state murder. But the speed and thoroughness with which communities can turn against individuals based on accusations that later turn out to be false or exaggerated does echo the dynamics of Ann's rapid fall from grace, suggesting that mob justice and presumption of guilt are human tendencies that technology accelerates rather than creates. Ann's inability to defend herself effectively in a system rigged against her mirrors modern women's experiences in legal and professional contexts where the rules theoretically apply equally, but practically favor people with more resources, better connections, and pre-existing credibility that women, especially women who've challenged powerful men, often lack regardless of the actual facts. The concept of a fair trial or fair hearing becomes meaningless when one party can afford unlimited legal representation while the other is bankrupted by defense costs. Or when workplace investigations into harassment complaints are conducted by people who depend on the accused for their own employment. Or when public opinion has already convicted someone based on leaked allegations before any formal proceeding occurs, and stood before judges who'd already decided to convict her before hearing any evidence. Which seems like obvious injustice until you consider how many modern legal and quasi-legal proceedings operate with similar predetermined outcomes, disguised as neutral processes, proving that the form of due process can exist without its substance when power dynamics overwhelm procedural protections. The question of whether we'd recognize an Boleyn situation if it happened today is complicated because we like to think modern legal protections, human rights frameworks, and social progress would prevent such obvious injustice. But history suggests that injustice simply adapts to whatever constraints exist rather than disappearing when we create new rules against it. Powerful people who want to destroy someone find methods that work within or around existing systems. Whether that's fabricating treason charges in the 16th century or weaponizing non-disclosure agreements, strategic litigation, media manipulation, and coordinated harassment campaigns in the 21st century. The specifics change, but the fundamental dynamics of power, gender, and destruction remain recognizable enough that Anne's story still resonates as cautionary tale rather than incomprehensible ancient history, which is either evidence of human nature's consistency across time or evidence that we haven't actually made as much social progress as we congratulate ourselves for achieving. And probably both things are true in ways that should make us uncomfortable about our own era's claims to enlightenment. If and Boleyn could observe modern society and see how her story has been remembered, reinterpreted, commercialized, and deployed for various political and cultural purposes, she'd probably be amazed that anyone still cares about her 500 years later, but also possibly disturbed that her judicial murder has become entertainment and her life reduced to romantic tragedy or feminist parable rather than being remembered as whatever she actually experienced, which we can never fully know, despite all our historical research and imaginative reconstruction. The fact that we've written thousands of books about her, created countless dramatizations of her life and death, and turned her execution site into a tourist attraction might seem like vindication or at least historical importance. But it's also a kind of violation where her suffering has been transformed into content for consumption by people who will never face anything like what she experienced but enjoy engaging with it as drama. And didn't choose to become a symbol or a cautionary tale or a feminist icon or a romantic heroine. She just lived her life making strategic choices in impossible circumstances and died horribly as a result of factors both within and beyond her control. And everything since has been other people projecting their own concerns onto her story. The contemporary debates about Anne's guilt or innocence, her motivations, her relationship with Henry, and what her story means are ultimately more about us than about her, revealing our own anxieties about female ambition, sexuality, power, and what happens to women who challenge or disappoint men with authority over them. We keep returning to Anne's story because it crystallizes questions that remain unresolved in our own time. How much agency did she have versus how much was she trapped by circumstances? Should we admire her ambition or condemn her complicity in Catherine of Aragon's suffering? Was her execution an aberration or a pattern? Can we simultaneously recognize her as victim and acknowledge her as flawed human who made choices we might not approve of? These questions don't have simple answers in Anne's case, and don't have simple answers in contemporary cases either, which is why her story remains compelling rather than settling into comfortable historical consensus where everyone agrees on what happened and what it means. The value of studying in Boleyn's story isn't just learning about Tudor history, but recognizing patterns in how societies destroy women who threaten male power structures, how legal systems can be weaponized for personal vendettas, how quickly someone can fall from favor when they're no longer useful to people with power, and how difficult it is to resist or even recognize injustice when it's dressed up as a legitimate process and supported by official institutions. These lessons apply whether we're analyzing a 16th century queen's execution or a contemporary woman's experience with legal abuse, professional retaliation, or coordinated reputation destruction, because the fundamental dynamics remain consistent even when the specific mechanisms change. Understanding in story might not prevent modern equivalent from happening, but at least provides framework for recognizing them when they occur and potentially resisting the narratives that justify destroying people who become inconvenient to those with more power than they have, which is modest progress, but better than nothing. So here we are, 500 years after Anne Boleyn knelt on Tower Green and lost her head for crimes she didn't commit, still debating what happened and what it means, still using her story to process our own concerns about gender, power, and justice. Still fascinated by a woman whose greatest crime was failing to produce a male heir and whose greatest misfortune was being married to a man with absolute power and the emotional maturity of a spoiled toddler who'd never been told no until he decided the word didn't apply to him. We've built monuments to her memory, written libraries worth of analysis about her life, turned her execution into entertainment, and generally done everything except learn the fundamental lesson her story teaches: that systems allowing individuals to destroy other people without accountability or real evidence will be used exactly for that purpose regardless of how we dress it up as justice. And that until we fundamentally restructure power dynamics that make some people disposable when they're no longer useful or pleasing to others, we'll keep creating new and Boleyns in different contexts with different specifics, but the same tragic outcome. The question isn't whether we've progressed beyond the world that killed in Boleyn. In some ways we clearly have, but whether we've progressed enough to recognize and prevent our own era's versions of judicial murder and gender destruction when they're happening right in front of us, dressed up in contemporary language and legal procedure. Would you want to be in Boleyn for even one day, knowing the power and status came with surveillance, pressure, impossible expectations, and potential execution if you failed to deliver what was demanded? The answer is obviously no for anyone with basic self-preservation instincts. And yet we're still fascinated by her story precisely because it represents both the allure of power and the terrifying fragility of that power when you're dependent on someone else's approval for your safety and survival, which remains uncomfortably relevant for anyone navigating relationships or systems where they have less power than the people judging them.